This morning I'm with Andy Harmer, who is, of course, the Senior Vice President of Membership and the UK and Ireland Managing Director of Clia. Andy, Clia has released this morning some really interesting figures around the value of the cruise industry to the economy. Just talk us through those numbers, because they're pretty big.
They are pretty big. Hi, Lucy. We talk about a global industry of about $150 billion, and we talk about a UK industry that actually is income to the economy of about $10 billion. And the figures we're talking about today suggest that if we suspend our operations for 60 days, then it will cost the economy in the region of £1.5 billion, and you're looking at an impact on jobs of about 9,000 people, and therefore their families and communities, etc. Now, of course, we're not saying that the voluntary suspension that we introduced a couple of weeks ago was the wrong thing to do. It wasn't. It was absolutely the right thing to do. But I think the point that we're trying to make is that the cruise industry is much bigger than the ships and the ports that we serve. It's actually the communities that sit around those coastal areas. It's the places that we visit with our guests, but it's also suppliers to the industry as well. So whether it's food manufacturers or carpet fitters or wines and gins and beers, and all of those industries that support the industry. And this is obviously an important point to make, that it will have an impact, and that actually when cruising does restart its operations, when the time is right, that it can have an important impact on the recovery of the UK economy as well.
Yeah. And one of the groups that I know you mentioned there as being reliant or certainly involved in the cruise industry is also travel agents. Of course, you've highlighted them as also being dependent on a thriving cruise industry.
Yeah, and the cruise industry relies heavily on the travel agent community for their support. And in terms, the hit that we talk about from suspending operations for 60 days, that includes the loss of income to travel agents, for example. And that we know that the travel agent community is suffering. These are challenging times for the whole travel industry. And travel agents are a key part of that. And, I think one of the things that we want to do is to highlight the impacts of this global pandemic is having on communities and coastal communities and the cruise industry as well.
Yeah. Now, and you talk there about 60 days, Andy, but you also, in your press release this morning, you do the calculations for 90 days. I'm just wondering, as a global cruise industry, I know no one has a crystal ball about when this is going to come back, but how far out is the cruise industry planning for having to suspend its cruise operations, and how big could this economic impact be?
Well, as you say, I think that's very difficult to say. And I think the phrase that we're using is when the time is right. So, the cruise industry has a long history and tradition of working with health authorities, with governments, with the European Union, for example. We also work with the World Health Organization, the CDC, etc. So there are lots of health bodies that we're working with to ensure that when we do return to travel, that we'll also return to cruising as well.
Yeah. And I know that you are working so hard behind the scenes, because I've spoken to bosses of both ocean cruise lines and river cruise lines. They said it's their absolute primary focus to make sure that they have the procedures and protocols in place, some of which are already in place, but they're going to enhance them, and also make sure that they talk about them a lot more to reassure customers that it's safe. So can you give us any idea of what the global cruise industry, both ocean and river, are doing in that area?
Well, first, you make a really good point. I think the cruise industry has health and safety and wellness procedures that predate this and predate this pandemic. So, and that includes things like cleaning and sanitization. It includes pre-boarding screening. It includes health questionnaires. But it also includes things like having a medical facility on board all of our ocean ships. It includes having medical staff on all of our ocean ships. So those have always been in place. And I think as an industry, we've been very clear about that. And I think we've tried to be as transparent as possible. We keep medical records and we share them with ports of call and other authorities, for example. So those are already in place, and we certainly enhanced them earlier this year as this pandemic became a global emergency as such. So the kind of things that we will look at, I've mentioned some of them there. It will include things like screening, things like the medical staff that we have on board, things like preventative preventative measures, cleaning and sanitization, and all of those areas. And as a global industry, what's great about Clia and what's great about Cruise is that we share best practice, and we work together, and we have some great teams working around the clock to make sure that when the time is right, that we will have the right processes and procedures.
Yes. Well, of course, there was an announcement by the government just last night that the social restrictions that are in place at the moment are likely to continue for the rest of the year. They were talking that, you know, some things may come back, but they were saying, I mean, they didn't talk about travel at all. Sure. But do you think travel may well be impacted by that? Because, you know, they're saying perhaps hotels, pubs, restaurants might be the last to open, and presumably travel will be affected by that announcement.
Well, and I think we must remember that cruise, as well as travel, is part of that leisure industry, as part of that social, arrangements that we all go through. So, of course, you have to look at the measures that have been taken and the measures that we need to follow in social distancing, and how that applies to things like cinemas and airlines and conferences and restaurants and all of those things. So, you know, again, we work, the cruise industry is very good at working with health authorities and governments so that the time is right, and we will introduce those measures.
So you think that cruise lines will likely have to do something around social distancing as well as all the other things you just talked about?
Yeah, and I think, you know, we've both listened to and spoken to river cruise operators, for example, as well as some ocean cruise operators. And I think you listen to the government's advice, and I think we're aware that things are different. You know, this has affected all of our lives. Even everyday things like going shopping for food or you know, has been impacted. So, you know, it's difficult to say timelines. It's difficult to say what will happen next, because it's still a fast-moving situation. But certainly, you know, the cruise industry always puts its people at the heart of everything it does, whether it's its crew, its guests, or the places that we visit, and we'll continue to do that. And work alongside those health authorities to give us the best possible advice.
Okay, just final question, Andy. I know the cruise industry has been in the spotlight somewhat from the national media right from the outset of this pandemic. When I spoke to Arnold Donald, who is of course the chief executive of Carnival Corporation, he was very keen to point out that cruise was in no way the cause of this. It was in no way the spreader of this disease. He was saying it should be in no way singled out over any other form of travel. But it's a hard message for you guys at Clia and for the cruise lines to get across when you know, cruise ships have been plastered all over the national media. How are you countering that sort of that negative press? Because when we've heard from Arnold, he's very, very clear that you shouldn't be being singled out.
Yeah, and I think if you look at some of those national press headlines, some of them have been negative, some of them have been really, really balanced, some have been very positive. And I think it's a challenge that we have in the cruise industry in all areas, and that is that until people have been on board a ship or taken a cruise, they don't quite understand the measures that are taken, the focus that we have on health and safety and wellness, and the work that's done around the clock to protect our guests and crew. So Arnold, of course, is absolutely right, but you know, and we obviously continue to have a need to continue to talk to government, to journalists, to travel agent partners, and so on, to explain what we do as an industry to protect our guests.
You'll be stepping that up. You'll be, as Clia, you'll be sort of stepping up that kind of education, that element.
Yeah, absolutely, and timing, of course, is really important. You know, for the last 4 weeks, our industry has been really focused on getting ships back to port after we voluntarily suspended operations. And our focus has rightly been on the guests and the crew that have been on those ships. So now, you know, now that we are back, all of our ships are back in port, it's time to think about next steps and work with government and work with health authorities, and to understand what kind of operation that we will launch and when we're able to do that.
Okay, well, we wish you and the whole global cruise industry all the very best with that, Andy, and thank you for releasing those very interesting stats today, which I think will really help hit your, hammer your message home.
Thanks,
So
Lisa.
thanks very much, Andy Harmer from Clia.